All right, as you can see, Jemele Hill joins me now, a writer with theatlantic.com and formerly of ESPN.com. We'll get into ESPN in a moment, and it's interesting, especially in the context of what we've just seen at Web Summit. But I just wanted to ask a little bit about yourself. I think from an Irish perspective, we became aware of who you are after what happened over the last couple of years, after Donald Trump and Twitter. Where did you start? Where did your journalism career start, and what path led you to ESPN?
So my journalism career started really early. I knew since high school I wanted to be a sports journalist, and so I majored in journalism, had a bunch of internships, worked for my college newspaper. Before I got to ESPN in 2006, I had a full-fledged print journalism career, and so I had been covering college football, college basketball, the NFL, all of the major sports in America for about 10 years before I got to ESPN. And then over the course of 12 years, I went from being a ESPN.com columnist into a daily television role. So I had 2 shows there before I left ESPN in September.
So when you're building up your career for years, working hard, writing, I guess it's hard for us to tell on this side of the Atlantic, but being in America, I'd imagine if you were told that you're going to one day work for ESPN, straight away you're like, dream come true.
Yeah, for most people, like ESPN is the destination job if you're in sports media. I was a little different because I never actually wanted to work for ESPN.
Right.
My dream job was, because I was a writer at heart, that's my first love, my dream job was Sports Illustrated.
Okay.
Because they were, when I was growing up, that was the magazine, the sports publication of record. And, you know, I collected the covers and was a loyal reader to the magazine. So that's what I actually wanted to do. ESPN just kind of happened, and because it is such a big behemoth in America, you can go there as one thing and finish your career there totally in a totally different place. So I came in there just thinking I was just going to be a sports writer and a sports columnist. I left there as so much more, as a broadcaster, doing commentary and doing mostly television.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Well, just a moment on Sports Illustrated. Do you still buy the magazine, and how do you feel it's coping in the modern society?
Well, I do think it's a little different. It's tough for all magazines now because we become a society depending on that thing there, which is the phone. And so I still read Sports Illustrated. I read them now mostly as an online product. I probably haven't held the publication in my hand in I don't know how long, which shames me to say because I'm one of those people, like, I don't love reading books on my iPad or a Kindle. I need to feel the pages.
Sure.
So it does feel odd to have gone so long without actually picking up a copy of Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask you is, like, what was your favorite sports teams growing up? Like, was there particular covers of Sports Illustrated that you're looking at and you're like, that's a souvenir for me because it's my favorite sports man or woman on the front of that? Well,
so I'm from Detroit, and of course I was a fan of all the Detroit sports teams except for one, and that was the Lions, because they were terrible. They're still terrible. 50 years of futility. I mean, they're one of the few teams in the NFL that's never made a modern-day Super Bowl. So I was not a big Lions fan, but the Tigers won when I was growing up. The Pistons won, of course. The Bad Boys. That was a big deal. And you know, I went to Michigan State University. And I remember when Michigan State made the cover of Sports Illustrated. Well, one of them, I believe, is with Magic Johnson and Larry Bird on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Now, granted, I was 4 years old then, so I didn't have that cover, but it's one of the iconic covers specific to where I grew up. But I remember when LeBron James was on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a 16.
The chosen one.
The chosen one cover. Like, so they've done a number of covers where you kind of remember that space and time in sports, which is what I think made the publication unique, in addition to the storytelling and writing.
Yeah, for sure. So talk to us about ESPN. You get yourself into a position where you're anchor of SportsCenter at 6 p.m. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is one of the premier jobs in our industry. I mean, thinking about the broadcasters that have held that seat, Stuart Scott, Bob Lee, Keith Olbermann, Dan Patrick. I mean, it's a ton of legacy names that have been able to sit in that seat. So to get that job, it was something that I never saw coming, because when I came to ESPN, I didn't want to be an anchor. I wanted to just write. And then even when I started doing TV, the last thing on my list was being a SportsCenter anchor. So to get that opportunity, it was really humbling, and I was grateful that I've done it. As I like to kindly say, is that I'm pretty sure I'll go down in the record books of having the shortest stint on 6 o'clock SportsCenter. 13 whole months I made it.
So to anybody who doesn't know, explain to us why it was the shortest stint on SportsCenter.
Well, so when me and my former co-host Michael Smith, when we were given that job, they wanted to try to evolve SportsCenter. As some of your viewers may be aware, maybe they've seen Scott Van Pelt's version of SportsCenter, more personality-driven. The show is him, and so they wanted to move into more personality-driven SportsCenters. Mike and I had already had a show on ESPN2 called His and Hers that was very successful. So they wanted us to basically bring our personality to this sports center and kind of make it our own and make it the most maybe different sports center that they've ever had. And it was a challenge. It was a challenge because the 6 o'clock audience is different than the noon audience that we had. At 6 o'clock and your sports center, people want to see highlights, but what do you show them? Nothing's happened yet, right? Or the highlights you're showing them from the night before. They've already seen those. So it's a very tricky spot to navigate. And we used to run into a lot of people because we tried to not necessarily phase out highlights. We wanted to do a lot of video, but not necessarily highlights. But we would run into people all the time who would say, oh, we really like you guys, but we wish you would show more highlights. I'm like, but you've already seen them. And so it was just a difficult audience to navigate. So some of the stuff that we used to do on His and Hers didn't work necessarily on the 6 o'clock Sports Center. And halfway through our time there, we had a leadership change, and they wanted to revert back to more traditional Sports Center, which that's really not what Mike and I got into that to do. It certainly wasn't for me. And so it just didn't feel like a good fit for me. And so I asked to leave.
Right. And then what happens?
So then after I asked to leave, I went to join an ESPN vertical site called The Undefeated, which focuses on the intersection between race, sports, and culture. And I wrote for The Undefeated, still was doing television, but on different commentary shows people are familiar with, Around the Horn, Highly Questionable, Sports Nation. So I was just kind of bouncing around doing TV, returning to my first love of writing. And yeah, I mean, I did that up until, September, because I'd done so much at ESPN. It's the best job I've ever had. It's the longest job I've ever had. I was there for 12 years, so clearly it was something I liked about the place, right? But it got to a point where there was nothing left for me to do. There was nothing else I wanted to do, and I thought it was just kind of time, for me to move on. I kind of compared it to a relationship where you may love each other, but you have no business being together.
Okay.
And that's kind of where we were.
That's an analogy right there. So, can we talk about Charlottesville? Because that's the moment when, as I say, I think most people who like holiday in the United States, we show on ESPN, it's the first thing we do. So a lot of Irish people probably know your face from just turning on ESPN. But I think that was the first time when everybody realized who you really were at that point, when it was like, I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of people that I work with, were absolutely delighted to see somebody take a stance in a position like that, and particularly when there was a bit of blowback, that you actually stood firm on what you believed in, and you weren't going to back down off this. So explain to us what happened on Twitter and the response from Donald Trump.
Well, you brought up Charlottesville, and that was for a lot of people in the States. It was very triggering. And, my mother, she grew up in the civil rights era, and so she had described a lot of what we saw in Charlottesville, except for it was even worse.
In Detroit?
Detroit, because she was 11 years old when the 1967 riots happened in Detroit. And so she had seen that level of violence, and certainly nobody in the States is naive. We all knew racism existed. But to see, white supremacists, Nazi sympathizers, people even just calling themselves flat out Nazis, to see them take over an American city was troubling, to say the least. Worse than that was the fact that they not only felt emboldened and empowered, but that our own president seemed to have trouble condemning that behavior. And, when you're in sports, and especially working at a place like ESPN, you sort of have to almost distance yourself from being a citizen of the country, because when people tune in to see me at 6 o'clock, they're not tuning in for my political opinions. They're tuning in to hear my takes on the NFL or the NBA or various other sports topics. And so there was a lot of frustration I had built up just being a citizen and watching that unfold and seeing the behavior and tone of our government. And I got into a back and forth with somebody on Twitter, and I just said what it was. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence where that is very disconcerting when it comes to our president and how he feels about certain ethnic groups, how he feels about women. This is all there, public record for everyone to see. And so when I said what I said about him, I didn't really think I was saying anything that was controversial or surprising, because, again, the case had been pretty clear. But nevertheless, it created a lot of attention. It became a huge national controversy. And, he attacked me, he attacked ESPN. And, the White House thought what I said was fireable. I didn't get fired. And so it became just kind of this thing. So whereas before that happened, people would come up to me and want to ask, if I thought Tom Brady was the greatest quarterback ever. Now when they come up and talk to me, they want to, get out their own thoughts about the president and about our government, or just discuss, you know, social or racial issues. So it's really flipped my life in a completely different direction.
Are those people largely supportive?
Everybody's been supportive. I've never had a negative interaction with somebody based off everything that happened. I mean, look, I'm not going to kid you. After that, you know, I got a lot of hate mail. You know, ESPN had to beef up security, and I even had to shut off the voicemail, my voicemail at work, because the messages that were left were so threatening and so nasty. So there was certainly a lot of vitriol that was directed my way, and of course on social media. But the people that I meet in public and talk to, I've never had to encounter any of that. And it just kind of goes to what I've always believed is, like, some of those people that yell the loudest on social media, the all caps crowd, like, they're real good keyboard warriors. They're not going to say the same thing to you in person.
Yeah. What sort of threatening letters were you getting?
Oh man, I mean, I got called some of everything. I mean, a lot of racial slurs, a lot of, you know, negative comments about me being a woman, and just, you know, go back to Africa, like, you name it. Trust me, I was called it, I was told it. I was weirdly kind of amused and impressed by those who did snail mail, because, like, who the hell sends letters anymore? So I was like, man, you got to be really committed to this racism to send me this snail mail. But I did. I had a stacks of letters, and so it was, you know, it was very bizarre for me to have to go through that. And I remember the Monday after I made those comments, I was going to Monday Night Football to see the Giants and the Lions play, and I actually had to have security because at that point I had not been out in public. And so I wasn't really sure how people would react and respond, especially when you have a stack of hate mail letters that are calling you a bunch of things and, you know, threatening you and that sort of thing. But again, as I said, my public interactions with people have been fine.
Yeah, it is. I personally can't comprehend why people out there feel that it is an absolute rule that sport and politics have to be separate, and it's quite timely to be having this discussion because of everything that's going on with Colin Kaepernick at the moment, and the way you can make a very strong argument that he has been blackballed by the league. But let's not have that argument now. What's your view on Colin Kaepernick and his treatment and the way he's been discussed in public? Of course, the one thing you and Colin Kaepernick have in common is that Donald Trump has taken to the airwaves to say things about you both.
Well, I'll say this. Those people who want to believe sports and politics do not mix are just being intellectually lazy. They've always mixed. And I think what usually is the case, why people say stick to sports, or I don't want them to mix, is because they usually don't agree with the issue that it's clashing with. Like in Colin Kaepernick's case, a lot of vitriol has obviously been directed his way, and then it's become this distraction of an argument about patriotism and the flag and who's a patriot and who's not. But it all boils down to the fact that there are a lot of people who disagree with what Colin Kaepernick do not believe that police brutality is that big of a problem, or they're okay with it. And so because of that, I think that triggers the response, the negative response to him, because if Colin Kaepernick were kneeling for domestic violence victims, I don't think that anybody would be directing vitriol his way, and he wouldn't be blackballed from the NFL. But he's touching on a issue that is combustible in our country, because it is race, it's the police, law enforcement, and now you throw in patriotism. You know, law enforcement and patriotism have become, they're huge ideals in America. And so to challenge either one of those things is going to put you in the crosshairs of a lot of people. I think Colin Kaepernick did what he felt was right. Unfortunately, he will never play in the NFL again. I'd be stunned if that happened. The NFL owners have decided that they would rather keep him out the league than jeopardize any business relationships, any fans, even though, I mean, considering the national anthem, most times you miss it in the broadcast anyway. I think their concerns were always overblown, but 20 years from now, when we look back on this, they're gonna have to live with the fact that they blackballed somebody from the league who stood for social justice and tried to give a voice to people who are vulnerable. That person's blackballed, but you look across NFL rosters, you see plenty of players who have been accused of very serious crimes. Some have been convicted of crimes who are still playing in the NFL. So I've said this repeatedly, it bears saying, if Colin Kaepernick had hit a woman, he'd be back in the NFL.
That's a very interesting point, but it's probably true.
Yeah, I mean, what he's speaking to and who he's challenging, the level of authority, the system that has criminalized and over-sentenced people of color forever, like those are that's going to make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And we've seen the NFL forgive players. Not that Colin Kaepernick needs to be forgiven for anything, nor has he committed any crimes, but we've seen that league be a landing spot for people who have done or been accused of some very heinous things. I mean, Ray Lewis was once accused of murder, and he became a leading NFL pitchman years later. And yes, he was exonerated, but the whole point is that that's somebody who they had no problem welcoming him back into the NFL.
You just have to look around at the moment. You look at someone like Tyreek Hill in the league. It is demoralising to see the sort of the moral greying of what is acceptable and what is not. Like a guy takes to his knee because he protests against police brutality, and yet there are domestic abuse. There's very strong evidence against some people in terms of domestic abuse, and they're still playing football in the NFL.
Well, a lot of it is that they look at as egregious and as horrible as the act of hitting a woman is, or abusing a woman. They look at that as something that could be corrected. You can sell somebody who has been able to overcome being an abuser and been rehabilitated. What rehabilitation can you sell for Colin Kaepernick? You can't, because you know how he thinks now.
He's an uncontrollable.
Exactly. You know how he thinks. He's not going to wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, I had this thing all wrong. Black people are treated fairly by the police. He's not going to do that. So you can't control his critical thinking. You can't control his mind, and you can't control his outspokenness. So therefore, that's a much more dangerous element to them than, say, somebody who has been abusive. Because again, you can always sell the story of redemption on that. What is Colin Kaepernick being redeemed from? You can't sell that. And so I think that has a lot to do with why he isn't back in the NFL.
Yeah, definitely. Just another point on this, and we will wrap up. We'll be very generous with your time very shortly. Say if you're of Colin Kaepernick's political viewpoint and you're in that sort of position, I often wonder, do people feel that they should have a duty to go out and actually express yourself? Like, I mean, you take on one hand LeBron James, who is fantastic, he does what he does, but I think that's down to the NBA being a much more progressive league than the NFL. They don't feel as hamstrung as people in the NFL do, because clearly some guys lost his livelihood because of what he said and because of how he's protested. And then you look at someone like Michael Jordan, who clearly just he didn't feel as comfortable saying what he did. Maybe he doesn't believe as strongly as LeBron James. I don't think we'll ever find out, truly. But, Republicans buy sneakers too and all that. And the same goes for OJ as well, who, let's not forget, was becoming a huge global superstar at the same time when police brutality was also a huge talking point in the United States of America. Like, I do wonder, like, should we be more encouraging of these athletes to say, listen, it's going to be okay, you come out and talk, because you are the people who represent your communities better than anybody else in the world. Politics and sport, of course they should mix. They're the very same thing.
Well, I think with OJ's case, he had no interest. Michael Jordan was a little different because his activism, and this is a position I've softened on him over the years, because I used to be very critical. You mentioned the Republicans buy sneakers too comment, which he has become famous for. I think it was disappointing for a lot of people because that was associated with the Senate race in North Carolina with Jesse Helms, who is a notorious racist. And people just wanted Michael Jordan to support his opponent, a black candidate. And it seemed like the most obvious thing to do in the world, not because the candidate was black, it's because Jesse Helms was so terrible and he was a known racist. And so people were very disappointed that Jordan didn't take more of a stand. However, what I do think Jordan's legacy for black athletes in particular will be is that he showed that you can make a black man the face of a global company like Nike, and it can be not only become profitable, it can change an industry. And that was his legacy. And that's why, even though LeBron James is much more outspoken than him, he is able to borrow from that Jordan legacy and be his own enterprise. And I do think that part of the reason the NBA is progressive is because of LeBron. It's not a thing where they were going to be progressive all on their own, but when LeBron is the most important player in the league, he's the moneymaker of the league, he is the draw. If he feels a certain way about a certain issue or a certain president, then you have no choice but to fall in line, because that's your moneymaker. Yeah. So you have to do that. And as a result, because he's their best player and their most vocal player, then you have other guys in the league who follow suit. I mean, the Warriors, Steve Kerr, Greg Popovich, so many players in the league are outspoken, and a lot of it is because LeBron has taken the lead. Adam Silver is one of the more progressive commissioners out there, but we also can't forget that the NBA, we were talking about Colin Kaepernick being blackballed. They had their own track record in that regard. There's Craig Hodges.
We had him on the show, actually.
And Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. They blackballed 2 players for being outspoken about about the issues that impacted their community. So I'd like to think that the NBA sort of learned from their past behavior, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're not going to go against LeBron James, as he's a global superstar.
Well, what did you make of the Nike ad with Colin Kaepernick?
I thought it was brilliant, and one reason why Nike has been able to be such a mainstay and such a cultural force is that they've always had this kind of go against the grain mentality, and even though people sort of gave Nike credit for being charitable, that wasn't a charity decision, that was a business decision. All that, for all the attention and media focus on all the Colin Kaepernick detractors, there are at least as many, if not more, people who support him. Those people want to buy merchandise too, and more importantly, they want to support Colin Kaepernick. So for all those idiots you saw burning their Nikes on social media, there are 20 people that will easily buy 5 pair each just to compensate and overcome that. And oh, by the way, it's dumb to burn shoes you've already paid for, right? So you have that part of it, and all his merchandise has sold out like crazy. And Nike knew that, so they made a business decision. That's why he's in that ad, and I think that's an important factor to point out, because people look at Colin Kaepernick as if he's toxic, if he's not marketable. A lot of arguments that people like to make about why he's in the NFL is that he would cost an NFL team or owner money. No, he'd make them even more money because of who he's become. Yeah,
for sure. Last point, we were just watching you on stage there with John Skipper, formerly of ESPN. He suspended you?
He did.
Doesn't seem to be any bad blood there.
No. And it's, so obviously during the height of all the controversy with Donald Trump, John Skipper was the president. And so that's how the suspension happened. And it was obviously when I made those comments about the president, he was not happy with me, and not necessarily because he wanted to challenge what I said or what I believe, but because of the very difficult situation it put ESPN in. We talked about sports and politics. ESPN has unfortunately been in the middle of that discussion because people have looked at the network and said it's too political and use that as a means to attack the network. And so it was right during the hubbub and right during the height of that narrative. And so my comments come out and that certainly didn't help the narrative. And so John was understandably very angry at me. Now, he did not suspend me right away. I was suspended actually about some tweets I made about the NFL and Jerry Jones, and about how if there were so many people that were upset about Jerry Jones saying that he'd cut any player who decided to kneel in protest during the national anthem. And my position was just like, if you're so upset about that, then why don't you make the choice with your remote and stop putting it on the players to have to stand up to these owners when the financial dynamic does not lend itself to doing that. You have the power because you're the fan, you're the consumer. So if you want to support Colin Kaepernick's cause or support the players who you feel like have been pushed and into this anthem policy change, then boycott.
Yeah, for sure.
The word you cannot bring up usually is boycott, not when you work for a network that's in business with all the leagues. And so I was suspended for 2 weeks after that. And the day before I came off my suspension, John and I had breakfast. We've always had a very good relationship. And I told him then, I'm not going to take back what I said, but I understood exactly why he suspended me. So there's never been any bad blood between the two of us. And we just kind of got a kick out of being on stage together, both two people who have left ESPN and now are on to different and new and exciting paths in our career.
You could have just done the roast of ESPN up on stage.
We probably could have. Hey, look, don't give us any ideas. That might be coming to a stage near you.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Jemele, it's been great to chat to you. Thank you so much for being so generous.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate it.